I went to my wife's romantic dinner with her lover and said, "How do you explain this?" She went white. Pale. Her eyes drained as if the blood had left her body. I saw her freeze, frozen in time as if the whole world had stopped around us. I hadn't expected to find her there, not like that, not in the dress I'd bought her for our anniversary. She ran to me, flustered, stumbling over herself, her breath caught in her chest, saying, "I can explain," but there was nothing more that needed explaining. Because the explanation was already there, right before my eyes, on a candlelit table, with 2 glasses of wine, a muffled laugh, intertwined gazes, and the hands she used to hold mine now resting on another man's. I simply replied, "You don't need to explain anything else to me. I know what happened here. I'm leaving. Be happy with him." There were no screams. There was no scandal. Just silence. A silence that screamed from within. The silence of someone who, inside, was in ruins. The pain of being betrayed doesn't come just from the image of 2 people gazing at each other with desire. It comes from the details, from the memory of what was good, what felt right. It comes from everything you gave, how much you trusted, and most importantly, how much you loved. Because when you truly love, and are betrayed, it's not just your heart that breaks, it's your identity that cracks, your self-esteem that bleeds, your memory that is contaminated. The home you built with someone becomes an invisible battlefield where, every day, you must survive the idea that everything was a lie. Or, even worse, that it was true, but no longer is. That night, I didn't go home. And for weeks, my body continued to function on autopilot, as if the pain numbed time. I found myself replaying small scenes, the way she called me love, the lazy Sunday mornings, the plans for the future that now seemed like a joke. And the worst part wasn't knowing she had someone else. It was knowing she chose him. Because when someone cheats, it's not just a slip-up, it's a choice. And she chose. She sat with him. Laughed with him. Toasted with him. Touched him. While I, at that very moment, was probably thinking about her, maybe preparing something for when she got home. Naive. Blind. Ridiculous. In the days that followed, there were no immediate apologies. There was silence. And then, messages. Then, tears. But what had already been broken cannot be mended with belated regret. True love is like fine glass, once it breaks, it doesn't stick together. And even if you try, it never shines the same way again. She tried. He showed up at home a week later, his eyes swollen, his voice trembling. He said he didn't know what he was doing. That he had lost himself. That it all started with an innocent conversation and evolved into something she couldn't stop. He spoke of neediness, of routine, of loneliness at home. But none of those words were enough to justify what she did. Because she had options. She could have talked to me. She could have asked for help. But she chose to get involved. She chose to lie. You chose to betray me. Repeatedly. She said she didn't love the other man. That it was just an escape. A distraction. That what she felt for me was different. And it was. It was deeper. More real. And that's why it hurt so much. Because, even though I was the love of her life, she managed to betray me. And perhaps that's the worst kind of betrayal, the one that comes from someone who still claims to love you. Because it proves that love alone isn't enough. It takes respect. Choice. Commitment. Loyalty. Things she threw away. Over time, she asked me for forgiveness. And I did. Because I couldn't move on without forgiving. But forgiveness didn't come as she imagined. It didn't come to fix things. It came to bring closure. Because the love we had died there, at that restaurant table, before a toast that wasn't meant for me. And no matter how much she cried, pleaded, and repented with all her heart, and I know she did, none of it could erase the memory. The image of her smiling at another man remained, like a scar that time may heal, but never erases. Years passed. She tried to be happy with him. But she couldn't. Because what's born of lies doesn't flourish. She confessed to me, some time later, that she felt empty. That she woke up next to him with a hole in her chest. That everything seemed out of place. And she knew why. She knew the real mistake wasn't cheating on me, it was losing me. Because we can make mistakes. We can regret. But some losses are permanent. And even though there was still affection, empathy, maybe even love, there would never be an us again. She tried to win me back. She tried to remember the good times. She tried to show me she'd changed. And she had. But the problem was, I'd changed too. I was no longer the man who'd accept returning to something that had already destroyed me. And that hurt her more than anything else. Because she received the forgiveness she so desperately wanted. But the fresh start she hoped for never came. And perhaps that's the true punishment of those who betray, it's not losing the other person immediately. It's seeing them rebuild themselves without you. It's seeing them happy again, with someone else, and knowing that that space could have been yours, if you hadn't chosen to destroy it. Today, we are friends. Truly. With respect. With maturity. But never again with love. And even as time passes, even as life moves on, she still holds that silent question in her eyes, what if I had made another choice? She will never have the answer. And perhaps that is the true end of this story, it's not the pain that hurts the most, it's what could have been, and never will be. But what she doesn't know, what no one knows, is that, before the dinner where everything fell apart, something had already happened between the two of us, something that might explain why she looked for love elsewhere, something that, when revealed, might change everything you think about who was the victim and who was the culprit. Welcome to the channel. Here, no type of betrayal is romanticized or supported, quite the opposite. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, but built to show, with clarity and intensity, how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes feelings and leaves scars that time cannot erase. Get ready for a story shocking, realistic and exciting. Take a deep breath, and feel the weight of choices that cannot be undone. Daniel was the kind of man who carried an almost uncomfortable calm in the world's hurried eyes. He had a firm posture, but without arrogance, and a gaze that always seemed to seek meaning in small things, as if he saw value where others saw none. He worked as a university literature professor, one of those who still believed in the power of a well-written sentence and the poetry hidden between the lines of life. In the eyes of many, he was too discreet, too methodical, even too kind. But there was a quiet beauty in the way he lived, a genuine dedication to what he loved, and especially to the woman he chose to walk with him. Julia. His opposite in many ways. Where he was introspective, she was expansive. Where he observed, she threw herself into it. Where he pondered, she took risks. Julia was lively. She had a smile that seemed to light up a room and a laugh that could dispel any tension. She wasn't an obvious woman. She loved art but hated galleries, she read novels but considered herself a realist, she was sociable, but hid an elegant solitude in the corners of her eyes. When Daniel met her, he felt he had found someone who challenged him emotionally, not through confrontation, but through contrast. Their relationship began almost accidentally. A shared coffee in a line at an exhibition, an exchange of opinions on an abstract painting, and then conversations that seemed never-ending. Daniel fell in love with Julia's way of seeing the world, chaotic, intense, unpredictable. Julia, in turn, was captivated by the safe haven he represented, the way he listened attentively, with no intention of fixing her. The two formed an unlikely but strong pair. They built a love that, at first glance, seemed balanced, a fair trade-off between freedom and security, dreams and structure. They lived in an airy apartment, with books everywhere, paintings with personal meanings, and plants that Julia forgot to water and Daniel silently tended. Their routines were filled with affection, the coffee he carefully made, the notes she scribbled before leaving for work, the leisurely dinners on the weekends. For the first few years, their relationship seemed to flow naturally. There was complicity, there was sex with abandon, there was easy laughter, and even their arguments had a certain elegance, because, deep down, they knew how to listen to each other. Daniel was never controlling, and Julia was never submissive. They were two fully fledged adults trying to build something together, with genuine and, by all appearances, unwavering affection. They had plans to have children, though the years passed without them materializing. She said it wasn't the right time, and he understood. There was no pressure, just the silent desire to see life grow around the love they had cultivated. Their friends saw them as a model couple. Not because of their perfection, because they never pretended to be, but because of their evident partnership, their respect, the way they looked at each other even in silence. At parties, Julia floated among the groups, telling stories, making jokes, charming. Daniel watched from afar, smiling tenderly, knowing that radiance was part of what made him love her. But not everything was breezy. As time passed, small cracks, almost invisible, appeared that neither of them quite knew how to name. Julia began to show a certain restlessness, as if the stability that once brought her security began to feel like a kind of invisible prison. She grew frustrated with Daniel's silences, with his calm that, at times, seemed distant. And he, though attentive, didn't know how to reach that inner place where she now seemed lost. He tried, with gestures, with listening, with patience, but the connection that once flowed naturally now required effort. Conversations no longer flowed as they once did. Not for lack of love, but perhaps because of the excessive internal noise they both didn't know how to share. Julia talked about new projects, career changes, traveling alone. Daniel supported her, even though, deep down, he feared something was slipping through his fingers. She sought more life outside, and he tried to keep his inner life functioning. This created a silent tension between them. Nothing blatant. No declared crisis. Just a gradual drifting apart, made up of small absences, glances that no longer met on the same frequency, touches that didn't linger, words that got stuck in the middle of the road. At times, Julia seemed to return to her old self. She'd come home excited, sharing details of new encounters, new interests, and Daniel would listen, smiling, trying to maintain his enthusiasm even when he felt he was no longer part of that new energy. He didn't complain. He was grateful for every ounce of love he had left. But something was changing. A hard-to-define emptiness, as if they still shared the same house but no longer the same breath. Daniel didn't talk about it with anyone. Not even his closest friend. He kept his discomfort to himself, perhaps afraid to admit that the love they'd cultivated so deeply might be growing sick. Julia, on the other hand, would confide in some friends, but always in a confused way, as if she didn't know exactly what she was feeling. She said she still loved Daniel, but that she felt invisible, as if she lived next to someone who no longer saw her with the same eyes. There was no betrayal. Not yet. But there was a shadow. And sometimes, shadows are the most dangerous omen. One afternoon, Julia came home later than usual. She said she'd lost track of time. Daniel believed her, as always. There was no suspicion, just a silent unease he couldn't explain. She seemed different. More distant, yet lighter. As if she were somewhere else. And that place wasn't his anymore. Even so, he tried hard. He prepared her favorite dishes, organized little surprises, booked weekends in cabins, just like in the early years. Julia smiled, thanked him, but the smile no longer reached her eyes. Something had broken there, but Daniel didn't yet know it. Julia, perhaps, didn't know it clearly either. She only felt something was missing, and she began searching for that something outside, in the wrong places, on the most dangerous paths. But for now, all was still silence. A silence that slowly cries out, but has not yet broken. There was still no declared pain. There was still no confessed failure. They were still a couple in the eyes of the world. They still shared a bed, still kissed in the morning, still said, "Good night, love." But inside, something was changing. And what neither of them knew was that, very soon, a choice would be made. A choice that would change everything. A choice from which there was no turning back. But until then, they were just Daniel and Julia. Two strangers trying to remain the couple who once fell in love by chance and built a love so beautiful it seemed unbreakable. Until it wasn't. Julia started going out more. The excuse was almost always the same: company events, dinners with colleagues, last-minute get-togethers. Daniel was never one to ask invasive questions. He trusted. He always had. Not because he was naive, but because he believed that love needed this space to breathe. But as the months passed, the frequency of these engagements began to bother her. There was nothing explicit, nothing that clearly pointed to a real problem, but there was a constant feeling that she was no longer present, even when she was at home. Julia became, increasingly, a polished version of herself in Daniel's presence, as if filtering her emotions and words to avoid causing discomfort. He noticed this exaggerated care and felt something slipping away with each passing day. Conversations became more practical, focused on bills, schedules, and chores. Displays of affection appeared as automatic gestures, devoid of their former spontaneity. Daniel tried to recapture the moments that had brought them together. He made reservations at places they used to like, bought tickets to plays, suggested quick trips to places they had visited in the past. Julia accepted, but was always distracted, torn between the present and a world Daniel couldn't access. On one such attempt, during a weekend in a remote cabin, he watched her as she fiddled with her phone with a discreet, almost restrained smile, as if trying to hide an emotion escaping the corners of her lips. That remained etched in his mind like a warning that refused to be ignored. The small gestures began to become symbols of something bigger. The lack of immediate response to messages, the restrained smiles, the sudden outfit changes to leave quickly, the constant need to be connected to something outside. Daniel began to notice the different perfumes she wore, sweeter, more striking, and her ever more elaborate makeup, even for informal encounters. He didn't want to suspect, didn't want to fuel paranoia, but there was a constant unease growing inside him. When he tried to talk, Julia brushed him off. She said she was tired, that everything was fine, that it was just a phase. But her gaze shifted from his with a frequency never seen before. And Daniel, who had always been calm, began to sleep with a tight chest, with thoughts that repeated themselves into the night, trying to find logic in the absence. The separation became unbearable. Their bodies still shared the same bed, but they no longer touched. Their words became measured, their breaths uneven. The feeling of being beside someone and, at the same time, alone was suffocating. Daniel began to mentally relive the last few months, trying to pinpoint where they had lost their way. But he found no answers. He still did everything for her. He made coffee, organized the house, remembered important dates. But he felt that, even offering everything, he was increasingly invisible to her eyes. Julia, on the other hand, was waging a silent war within herself. He knew what he was doing, but didn't know how to stop. She wasn't a cold or frivolous woman. But she had let herself be drawn into a closeness that, at first, seemed harmless. It began with long conversations about literature, then music, then the emptiness she felt even though she was married. It was an intellectual connection that soon transformed into something more intimate, more dangerous. She told herself it was just a momentary escape, that she still loved Daniel, that everything would return to normal. But it didn't. The other man began to occupy her thoughts, schedules, desires. Julia began to live two lives, one inside the house, with restrained smiles and attempts at normalcy, and another outside, made up of intense glances, intertwined hands, and tense encounters. And this duplicity began to take a heavy toll on her. The weight of guilt mingled with desire. She felt divided, torn, unable to decide which way to run. Daniel realized the definitive separation one Saturday night. They had planned to have dinner together. He spent hours preparing her favorite dish, bought the right wine, lit candles, and put on soft music. Julia had called minutes before, saying she couldn't make it, that a last-minute commitment had come up, something from work, an obligation. His voice sounded uncomfortable, but he didn't insist. He hung up and sat there, at the set table, staring at the cooling food. In that moment, something inside him crumbled. It wasn't anger. It was a silent mourning. The mourning of someone who realizes they're being left behind by someone who's still present. He got up, packed everything, sat on the couch, and remained silent. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think about what he'd been trying to avoid. And in that thought, he decided he needed to know the truth. Not for control, but for dignity. The next day, he waited for Julia to leave the house and, with no intention of invading her privacy, looked at the cell phone she'd left on the living room table. There were no passwords. There was no spying. There was just a series of recent, open messages, with a name he'd heard before in casual conversations. He read it slowly, as if unwilling to confirm what he already knows. The words were clear. There had been meetings, there had been promises, there had been intimacy. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. The betrayal was there, naked, direct, pulsing on the screen of a forgotten device. Daniel didn't react immediately. Not that it didn't hurt. But because the pain was so deep that he froze. He got up, washed his face, and went for a walk. He considered confronting her, screaming, crying, demanding an explanation. But he decided to wait. Wait for the right moment. Not for revenge. But out of dignity. Out of self-respect. In the days that followed, he acted as if he knew nothing. He watched Julia with the delicacy of someone who no longer expects anything, but still loves. And that was what destroyed him most, loving someone who was already elsewhere. She continued to act cautiously, believing she could still hide it. But there were too many signs. When she said she was going to a company dinner, Daniel just nodded. When she smiled, looking at her phone, he just watched. There were no more questions. Just the silent preparation for the revelation that needed to happen. And this revelation came one random weekend, at a restaurant where Julia had said she would be with colleagues. Daniel, on impulse or intuition, decided to go there. Not to keep an eye on things. But because, deep down, he knew what he would find. He arrived, entered, looked around. And saw it. Julia, sitting at a corner table, smiling, her hands on another man's. The scene was brief. But enough. The image burned within him with a power no words could explain. He walked to the table, stopped in front of the two of them. Julia saw him and immediately paled. Her hands retreated, her smile faded. Silence engulfed the room around her. She tried to stand, tried to say something. But Daniel, his voice firm and calm, simply said, "How do you explain this?" And in that moment, she knew everything was about to fall apart. She tried to respond, mumbled apologies, and held out her hands. But he cut her off, pain evident in his eyes. "You don't need to explain anything else to me. I know what happened here. I'm leaving. Be happy with him." And then he turned his back, leaving behind not just a betrayal, but an entire love. And what Julia didn't yet know, what was still waiting to surface, was what had truly been lost at that table, something much bigger than a marriage, something that, when revealed, would forever change the way she saw herself, the man she once claimed to love, and everything she had chosen to destroy. Life went on after dinner. Not normally, not peacefully, but it went on. Daniel didn't return home that night, nor the following. He grabbed some clothes and documents and checked into a temporary hotel in the city. Julia sent messages, left voicemails, tried to call him countless times. He didn't respond. He was silent, not out of contempt, but because he still needed to figure out how to deal with the pain without letting it break him completely. What hurt most wasn't the end, it was the way it all ended. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, deep, and lingering. Julia didn't stumble on impulse, she built, little by little, a new bond in the shadow of the one she still had with him. And that, for Daniel, was non-negotiable. However, the days of distance and silence slowly gave way to something else, understanding. Not acceptance, nor forgetting. But the realization that if he wanted to move forward, with or without her, he would need to face that pain head-on, and more than that, understand what had caused everything to fall apart. Because, deep down, Daniel knew that no love dies overnight. There are always cracks that form, small choices that accumulate, absences that grow silently. And he was also present in this process, albeit passively. It was after a week that Julia finally managed to talk to him. She sent a message saying she didn't want to justify the unjustifiable, but needed to ask for forgiveness by looking him in the eye. Daniel didn't respond. He just showed up. The apartment still bore his marks everywhere. The books on the shelf, the pair of slippers on the bedroom door, the painting in the living room they had chosen together on a long-ago trip. Julia greeted him with tired eyes, no makeup, her hair tied up messily, and a look that mixed fear, shame, and a stifled love that, despite everything, still existed. She asked him to sit down, offered him water, and tried to disguise her nervousness with banal gestures. Daniel refused. He stood, hands in his pockets, staring at her with a serene yet distant gaze. She began speaking slowly, her voice low and trembling, saying she hadn't expected him to show up at that restaurant, that she'd never had the courage to tell him because she didn't know how to face her own guilt. She admitted she'd lost herself, that she'd confused need with passion, that she'd searched outside for something she felt had disappeared inside her. She spoke honestly. She admitted her mistake unapologetically. She wept. Daniel listened silently. Without interrupting, without reacting. When she finished, the silence between them felt like a minefield. Until he finally spoke, with a calmness that hurt more than any scream, "I forgive you." Julia broke down. She tried to reach out, touch him, seek some sign of hope, but he gently backed away. He said forgiveness wasn't an invitation to a new beginning, but closure. That there was still affection, but the love she destroyed that night couldn't be rebuilt. Julia insisted, saying she wanted to win him back, that she wanted to prove they could still be happy. But Daniel shook his head, his gaze making it clear he was already gone, even though he was still there. She stood still, tears streaming down her face, as if only in that instant had she grasped the true meaning of loss. And it was in that moment, faced with the impossibility of starting over, that she felt the need to say something she'd been holding back since long before the betrayal. A confession that burned inside her, that she carried like a burden, and that, no matter how much she thought she could bury, now seemed urgent, necessary, almost vital. She asked him to sit down, saying she needed to tell him something she'd never had the courage to reveal. Daniel hesitated, but sat down. The air between them felt thicker than ever. Julia took a deep breath, stared at the floor, and began. She said that, a few months before the betrayal, on a random night, she had decided to talk to Daniel about what she was feeling. She said she no longer felt seen, that she had become invisible within the marriage, that she needed to be heard, desired, and rescued. She said she had started this conversation with the intention of asking for help, of trying to salvage what was left between them. But that night, when she tried to open up, Daniel interrupted her mid-sentence, saying he was tired, that he needed to sleep, and that they could talk about it later. And later never came. It made her feel rejected, disposable, and it was in this emptiness that she began to open herself to the presence of another. Daniel listened attentively, but without showing surprise. He knew he had failed at times, knew his silence had also been cruel. But what Julia said next changed everything. She said that even so, after that frustrating night, she had tried one more time. And that was when, without meaning to, she found an old diary of Daniel's stored in the office closet. He read it, perhaps on impulse, perhaps out of necessity. And inside that notebook, he found something he never imagined, a letter he had written months before, in which he said he had felt her drifting away, that he was afraid of losing her, but that he didn't know how to reach her again. A letter never delivered, but full of pain, of love, of a fragility she never imagined existed within him. The letter spoke of the fear of not being enough, the feeling of being left behind, the frustrated attempt to keep the marriage going when it already felt like it was being pushed away. Julia, upon reading those words, was shocked. Because she realized that, at the same time as she felt ignored, he also felt rejected. They were both screaming inside, but in opposite directions. And because they didn't listen to each other, they ended up losing each other. Daniel lowered his head. He was silent for a long time. Then he looked up and asked why she had never talked about it. Julia said she was embarrassed. That she felt like she was invading something very intimate. That she didn't know how to approach it. And that when she finally found the courage, she was already too involved with the other person, had already crossed the line of return. Crying, she said she felt miserable. Because now she knew that if she had truly opened up about that conversation, maybe everything could have been avoided. He took a deep breath. He said the letter wasn't an excuse. That it didn't justify her, but it helped her understand. And that, in a way, was what hurt the most, knowing that maybe they could have saved everything if they'd had the courage to bear themselves emotionally sooner. Julia came closer and asked him to read the letter with her. I wanted him to feel that somewhere along the way, they'd still tried. Daniel took the notebook with trembling hands. He read the letter aloud. His voice faltered. His heart was heavy. It was a farewell to a man who loved and no longer knew how to be loved. When he finished, Julia was in tears. Daniel too. They fell silent. There was no more anger, no more masks. Just two wounded people, sitting side by side, carrying the wreckage of a love that was real but couldn't withstand their carelessness. Julia asked if he still loved her. Daniel said yes. But that it was a different kind of love. A love that forgave but wouldn't return. And that's when she understood. That, no matter how much forgiveness came, the consequences of the choices made in the past were irreparable. She lost the love of her life. Not for lack of love, but for choosing the wrong moment to give up. And as the day grew dark outside, the two of them stood there, side by side, like good friends, like intimate strangers, like a couple who loved each other deeply and destroyed each other in silence. And even with everything said, everything explained, there was still something to come. Something Julia still needed to see. Not with her eyes, but with her heart. Because the true impact of everything that had happened was yet to be revealed. After that day, there was no reconciliation. Nor was there an abrupt break. Daniel didn't disappear from Julia's life, nor did she beg for a return she already knew was impossible. What happened, however, was a long, silent goodbye that they both experienced in their own way. From that afternoon on, they went their separate ways, albeit with timid steps, carrying on their shoulders the weight of what they had experienced and what they had destroyed. Julia, now alone in the apartment that had previously seemed too large simply because it was empty, began to rediscover its spaces. The paintings, once harmless, began to bother her. The dining table for two, now always set with only one plate, became a cruel symbol of what was left behind. And the bed, which they occupied with their bodies entwined, became cold, wide, and impersonal. It wasn't Daniel's physical absence that hurt, but the silence he left in every corner of the house. A silence that carried memories, interrupted conversations, unreturned glances, words she wished she had said before everything exploded. Daniel, for his part, rented a small apartment near the university. A simple space with light walls, large windows, and a view of nothingness. He needed silence, but also light. The new home held no memories, and that was all he needed at that moment, the chance to rebuild himself without being haunted by the past. He began to dedicate himself more fully to his work, got involved in projects, and accepted invitations to lectures he had previously declined. But even though he maintained a serene appearance, there were nights when the pillow was complicit in the tears he wouldn't allow to fall during the day. He wasn't crying for Julia, but for the end of the version of himself that existed alongside her. It was as if he had lost a part of his own identity, the one that was born and blossomed in the love they once shared. A few weeks later, Julia decided to write. Not a letter of reconciliation, but a confession. She needed to say everything she felt, without expecting a response. She grabbed a pen and paper, perhaps in an unconscious attempt to return to the essence of when everything was still simple between them, and wrote. She said she still woke up thinking about him, that she still heard his voice when walking through the house, that sometimes she would pick up 2 pieces of cutlery before remembering she was alone. She said the man she'd cheated on him with had disappeared from her life a few days after that fateful dinner. There were no arguments, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a sudden, almost cruel separation, which she didn't try to stop. Because deep down, she knew that relationship was built on a rotten foundation. And that, no matter how much he told her what she wanted to hear, she never loved him. It was Daniel she loved. Always had been. But the love she felt now was bittersweet. It tasted of regret, of loss, of belated realization. She said in the letter that she understood why he didn't want to return, that she didn't expect anything more, but that she needed him to know, she understood. She understood that the betrayal began long before the physical touch. It began when she stopped fighting, when she chose to remain silent, when she preferred to be understood by a stranger rather than face the pain of talking to the man she loved. She ended the letter by saying she hoped he would be happy. Truly happy. That he would find someone who would look at him the way she should have looked at him until the end. She folded the paper, put it in a plain envelope, and handed it to him as he left college, without ceremony, simply saying, "No need to reply. Just read it." It took Daniel 3 days to open it. Not out of contempt, but out of fear of what he would find between the lines. When he finally read it, alone, in the early hours of the morning when sleep refused to come, something inside him broke. The pain gave way to a gentle longing. A longing for what was true, even if only for a limited time. And there, between lines written with regret and love, Daniel realized that Julia had finally understood everything. And that, in itself, was a form of redemption. Time passed, as it always does. The two moved on with their lives, albeit with open wounds. They met new friends, reconnected with old ones. Julia returned to painting, something she had neglected during her marriage. She redecorated the house, removed old photos from frames, and displayed images of solo trips. Little by little, she relearned how to be with herself. Daniel, on the other hand, grew closer to a coworker, Anna, someone with whom he shared intellectual interests and a discreet sensitivity that, in some ways, resembled Julia's early likeness. But it was different. There was no comparison. It was a new bond, free from the shadows of the past. And when, months later, Anna placed her hand over his during coffee, he knew he was ready to start over. Not because he had forgotten Julia, but because he had learned to live with the memory without pain. It was on a spring morning, almost a year after their breakup, that Julia and Daniel met again by chance at a book fair. There was no tension. Just shy smiles and a calm greeting. They chatted for a few minutes, exchanging impressions about titles, talking about trivialities, and then she, courageously, asked if he was okay. Daniel smiled slightly and said yes. He asked about her, and she said yes too. And in that brief moment, without saying anything explicit, they both knew they were at peace. A few days later, he invited her for coffee. Just as friends. Julia accepted. And it was at that reunion that, for the first time since then, they spoke lightly. They laughed, reminisced about good times, talked about projects, books, and the weather. Julia saw a tranquility in Daniel's eyes she hadn't seen in years. And, at the end of the meeting, when he said goodbye with a long, tight, and respectful hug, she realized she had lost that man. Not to another woman. But to her own absence. To the void that had created between them over the years. She didn't cry. She just felt. That night, when she got home, she opened the last folder of old files on her computer and found a video of a trip they'd taken 5 years ago. They were in a small town, it was raining lightly, and they were both laughing about something trivial. Julia found herself looking at Daniel with a sparkle in her eyes she hadn't seen in a long time. And then she understood. She truly understood. What she'd lost wasn't just a husband. He was the only man who saw her completely. Who truly loved her, who tried to hold on to her even when she was slipping away. She'd lost a home. And now, though she'd learned from the pain, there was no going back. A few months later, Daniel married Anna. It was a simple, intimate ceremony, where close friends were moved by the vows that spoke of rebuilding, patience, and mature love. Julia was invited. She considered declining. But she decided to go. She sat discreetly on a side bench. She applauded sincerely. She smiled tenderly. And when Daniel's eyes met hers for a brief moment, there was a respectful nod. No hard feelings. No melancholy. Just gratitude. Julia returned home at peace. For the first time in a long time. She knew that, even though she was no longer the love of Daniel's life, she had been part of a true story. And that, as painful as it was also a privilege. What remained, in the end, was not the scandal of betrayal, nor the emptiness of loss. It was the certainty that love, when wounded, may not survive, but it teaches. It teaches us to listen before silence screams, to value before it disappears, to repair before it breaks. And, above all, it teaches us that there are mistakes that, no matter how much they are forgiven, leave scars where there were once promises. Scars that no longer hurt, but that will never be erased. Daniel's wedding to Anna wasn't an event shrouded in ostentation or unrealistic promises, but rather a delicate ritual, enveloped in a serene atmosphere charged with meaning. Between their joined hands and knowing glances, there was a maturity that time, pain, and reconstruction had patiently honed. Daniel wasn't the same man who once left the restaurant with a shattered heart, nor was he the one who spent nights in silence trying to understand the void Julia had left. He had been reborn in his own skin, with different certainties, different fears, and above all, with the awareness that loving again required courage, but that this courage wasn't born from the absence of scars, it was born precisely from them. The love that grew between him and Anna wasn't made of youthful euphoria or impatient passions, but of respect, listening, and genuine surrender. Anna didn't try to take anyone's place, and perhaps that was what most attracted him to her, the lightness of someone who didn't impose herself, but who knew how to remain when everything was still shadowy. Julia, on the other hand, experienced Daniel's marriage as if watching the final scene of a film in which she starred and, suddenly, becomes just a spectator. It wasn't bitterness she felt, nor jealousy, but a melancholic nostalgia that manifested itself at the most unexpected moments. She went about her life with dignity, trying, day after day, to remain grounded in her new reality. The apartment had been renovated, the paintings replaced, the furniture rearranged, but there was a part of the memory that, no matter how hard she tried to erase, stubbornly lingered. It was in the sound of the kettle boiling, in the reflection of the window at dusk, in the smell of wood on a street they used to walk together. Julia began attending therapy, not out of desperation, but out of a need for understanding. She wanted to truly forgive herself, not just superficially. She wanted to understand why, having had so much, she had risked everything for so little. And the answer came in fragments, in silent sessions where only crying spoke, and in other more lucid ones, where she realized that she had become hostage to a lack that she herself created. In one of these meetings with the therapist, she faced one of the greatest moral dilemmas of her life: would love have been enough if she had chosen to fight instead of flee? The question wasn't about Daniel, nor about the other man, but about herself. About who he had become. About what I expected from a relationship, what I needed to give, and what I expected to receive. And the answer, though difficult to accept, was clear: yes, love was enough, but she didn't know how to sustain it. And understanding this freed her. Not in the sense of erasing the past, but of stopping running from it. Julia began to open up to other people, not with the same enthusiasm as before, but with the maturity of someone who has lost everything and survived to rebuild with greater awareness. The friendship between her and Daniel remained discreet. They exchanged sporadic messages, sometimes a quick greeting when they happened to cross paths, or a knowing smile when they shared the same social circle. Neither of them forced themselves on each other, but there was respect, and this was something they both sincerely valued. At one point, Julia was invited to an art exhibition where Daniel was to give a poetry reading. She considered declining, but something inside her compelled her to go. Arriving there, she saw him on stage, confident and serene, reading excerpts from authors who had always been part of their universe. At the end of the reading, their eyes met, and for a brief second, she felt as if she had gone back in time. But not with pain. Just with recognition. There was a man there whom she had loved, and who had loved her back. That was enough. As they left, they exchanged a few words. She congratulated him on the reading, he thanked her graciously. They talked about art, contemporary literature, and how words still had the power to heal. That's when Anna appeared. Elegant, with a welcoming smile and no hint of insecurity. She extended her hand to Julia and, with unexpected generosity, thanked her for coming. Julia responded honestly, saying she hadn't expected it, but that she was happy to see Daniel so well. Anna smiled and, with disconcerting simplicity, replied, "He's an incredible person. But before me, someone cared for him with great affection. Thank you for that." These words hit Julia like a hug and a punch at the same time. Because, in that moment, she understood that, even with everything that had happened, part of who Daniel was today also came from her, and that no one could erase. The following days were lighter. Julia began to write. Short texts, reflections, memories she'd previously kept to herself. Not with the intention of publishing, but of listening to herself, understanding herself, bringing order to the chaos that once inhabited her. She joined a book club, made new friends, and found pleasure in simple things. And one day, while walking through a park in the late afternoon, she felt the loneliness that had plagued her for so long begin to transform into solitude. It was no longer about someone's absence, but about her own presence. She began to see time differently, to demand less of herself, to truly forgive herself. And, above all, to accept that, although some choices have irreversible consequences, they also bring lessons that shape who we are. Daniel and Anna traveled during their first year of marriage. They visited places he and Julia had always promised to see but never managed. Not out of defiance, but out of a sincere desire to live in the present. On one of these trips, Daniel wrote a note to Anna saying that, for the first time in years, he felt exactly where he was supposed to be. And she, reading it by a window overlooking a golden field, responded with a silent kiss that said it all. They weren't perfect. But they knew how to love. They knew how to repair flaws before they became fissures, they knew how to listen slowly, they knew how to choose each other every day. And that was all Daniel had ever wanted. Upon returning from this trip, Daniel found among his old papers the letter Julia had written to him after their breakup. He read it again. He felt no pain, no longing, only a deep respect for that woman who, despite everything, had the courage to acknowledge her flaws and seek redemption. He put the letter in a folder labeled, "Things They Taught Me," and closed the drawer with a sense of true closure. There were no more holes, no unanswered questions. The cycle had closed with dignity, and that was rarer than any reconciliation. Meanwhile, Julia finally met someone. A calm, kind man who didn't make her feel pressured to be who she was. The beginning was shy, without great expectations, but little by little, she realized there was room for a new beginning. Not in the same way, not with the same intense glow as before, but with a soft, constant light that doesn't burn, only warms. She learned to value comfortable silence, honest conversation, and unhurried touch. She wasn't in love yet, but she was open. And that, for her, was a miracle in itself. As they reflected on everything they'd experienced, each of them carried their own version of the story. Daniel, certain that sometimes the purest love can't withstand a lack of care. Julia, aware that love is also a responsibility, and that every choice carries a weight. But both, silently, knew they had survived. That they had matured. And that, despite the pain, they were ready to live new stories with more truth, more respect, and less fear. But there was something Daniel hadn't said yet. Something he kept to himself, perhaps out of pride, perhaps for protection. A secret that wouldn't change the past, but if revealed, could rewrite Julia's perception of everything that had happened. He still didn't know if he would tell her. Perhaps it wouldn't be necessary. Perhaps it was the final piece of a story that had already been completed. But as he stared at the sunset from the balcony with Anna by his side, he felt that time would reveal it on its own. Because some truths don't need to be told. They just find their way to being understood. It was early autumn when Julia decided to answer that unspoken question that had been lingering inside her for months, whether, after all, she and Daniel could still see each other as people who respected each other, not for everything they'd experienced together, but for everything they'd survived apart. It had been almost a year since the divorce, his marriage to Anna was no longer a novelty, and their new life seemed to have settled on solid foundations, without the constant tremors of before. Julia didn't seek him out often, but she'd never completely disappeared either. The few contacts they maintained were punctual, objective, and always very cordial. Neither of them forced meetings, nor avoided them. It was as if time had made their connection a fine line between respect and a shy affection that still existed, albeit discreet. But at the beginning of the season, something inside her tightened its grip. Maybe it was the weather, the different breeze that made the leaves sway as if something were about to change again. She invited him for coffee. Not somewhere they both knew, but at a new bistro that had opened in the neighborhood next to their old apartment. A neutral spot. Daniel hesitated before accepting. He wondered if the meeting was necessary or if it would simply reopen wounds that were already healing. But, as always, his curiosity overcame his fear. He arrived at the appointed time, punctual as was his way. Julia was already waiting for him, sitting at the outdoor table, with an open book she clearly wasn't reading. Seeing him approach, she stood up with a restrained, almost shy smile. There was no air of nostalgia, but a distinct, mature calm, as if they had both accepted that this moment wasn't a return, it was a well-defined final point. "Thank you for coming," she said, pulling out the chair opposite him. Daniel nodded slightly and sat down, looking around for a few seconds before fixing his gaze on her. Her eyes were calm, less urgent, but there was a strange glint, as if something still needed to be said. She began talking about her work, then about the photography exhibition she'd visited a few days earlier, and mentioned the book club she'd joined. He responded with polite interest, but without elaborating. It was clear they both knew they were there for something more. And then, after the waiter left the coffees on the table and walked away, she took a deep breath and said, "I thought long and hard before calling you. I was afraid it would be a nuisance, or that you would think I wanted something I already understood no longer exists. But that's not it. I needed to close a door. Not because it's still open, but because I think we left it ajar, and that's preventing me from moving forward completely." Daniel watched her, with that introspective expression she knew so well, but which now seemed harder to decipher. She continued. "I carry with me a constant feeling that, no matter how much I've understood everything, no matter how much I've accepted the consequences of what I did, there's still something about you that I don't understand. It's not about me. It's about you. I never asked you, and maybe it's too late to ask, but I wanted to know, when did you truly lose me? Because I always imagined it was that night at the restaurant. But sometimes I feel like it was much earlier." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, running his fingers around the edge of his cup, as if searching for the answer at the bottom of the coffee. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, but firm. "You're right. It wasn't that night. That night only sealed the end. But the loss, it started before. It started with the absences you began to leave behind, which I pretended not to see. It started when you stopped telling me your fears and started hiding them behind a strength I knew wasn't real. But, Julia, I also lost you because I lost myself. I kept falling silent, pulling away, thinking I was giving you space, when in reality I was slowly abandoning us. Before I knew it, we were already on opposite sides of a wall neither of us built on purpose, but which grew too big to climb. And when I read that letter, the one you left later, I understood that the love was there, they were just both too afraid to hold on to it. Julia bit her lower lip, trying to contain her emotion. His answer was everything she feared and, at the same time, needed to hear. She had blamed herself so much for the betrayal, the escape, the impulse, that she constantly forgot that love doesn't die alone. She sighed and asked, "Do you think we would still be able to fix this, if I had told you before?" He looked at her with a sweet sadness in his eyes. There was no hurt there. Only awareness. I don't know. Maybe. But what I do know is that I no longer had the strength to try alone. And you no longer wanted to try with me. We lost each other because we stopped truly looking at each other. And there's no love that can withstand that. She nodded, her eyes welling up, and held the cup with both hands as if trying to control her feelings. They were silent for a few seconds, just listening to the sound of the world around them. It was strange how that moment, despite its weight, held a lightness they hadn't known how to feel before. Julia looked at him with honesty in her eyes and said, "I'm happy for you. I really am. I saw how you look at her. It's different. Freer. And I'm happy about that. Because even though I was responsible for everything, I know you deserved someone who would look at you like that until the end." Daniel smiled, a small but sincere smile. "And you, Julia, you deserve it too. Only now, you know how to look." She smiled back, moved, and in that instant she knew it was true. That the forgiveness she needed was no longer his. It was her own. And finally, for the first time since everything, she felt like maybe she was ready to give herself that forgiveness. They stood up, paid the bill, sharing it like two old friends who respect the history they've shared, and said goodbye with a long hug. It wasn't painful, nor regretful. It was a hug of gratitude. From someone who finally understood that love, no matter how true, doesn't guarantee a happy ending, but it leaves scars that, if well cared for, become the roots of something new. In the following days, Julia returned to life with more ease. She started a new course, traveled with friends, and one night met a man who didn't try to be her salvation, just company. A beginning without haste, without anxiety, without ghosts. For the first time, she wasn't looking for Daniel in another face. And Daniel, when he arrived home that afternoon, found Anna sitting on the couch, reading. She looked at him, smiled, and asked how it went. He simply replied, "It was good. It was necessary." And Anna, with the maturity that always charmed him, didn't ask any more questions. She simply came over, hugged him, and said, "I'm glad you weren't afraid to look back. It's what keeps us moving forward with more confidence." Daniel smiled. He didn't need anything else. No questions, no explanations. The past, finally, was at peace. And the future, well, the future was now. Time is a silent sculptor. It shapes pain until it becomes bearable, softens memories until they become less sharp, and rewrites our steps without asking permission. As the years pass, everything that seemed urgent becomes memory, and what was pain becomes history. Julia, after that coffee with Daniel, understood that she had reached the end of her guilt. Not of regret, because that never disappeared, but of the paralysis that comes with the feeling that one is unworthy of moving forward. She began to look at the world with less desperate, less nostalgic, and more real eyes. Real, as if recognizing that everything could have been different, but that even so, what remained has value. Real, as if accepting that she was not a victim of circumstances, but the author of choices, some disastrous, others necessary. She stopped searching for meaning in every loss and began to find value in what she could still build, even if with trembling hands. The relationship with the new man grew slowly, as if they both knew they were approaching with visible scars. He didn't try to fix her, and that was what touched her most. For the first time, she was with someone who wasn't trying to fill the empty spaces with promises, but with presence. Julia didn't fall in love like before. There was no explosion, no urgency of a consuming love. It was a calmer, more sincere feeling, like someone who understands that after losing themselves once, the best thing they can do is not rush to find themselves again. They didn't talk about the future like someone making grand plans. They talked about the present, about shared coffees, walks at the end of the day, the simple joy of having someone to listen, someone to return to. Daniel, in turn, plunged into a new cycle. Not because he was trying to escape the previous one, but because he accepted that pain is also part of growing up. With Anna, he found a kind of love he hadn't known before. A love less theatrical, less idealized, but much more stable and gentle. Anna was different from Julia in many ways, but that wasn't what mattered. What truly touched him was the way she insisted on being present even when the silence felt uncomfortable. It was the way she let him breathe without demanding answers, how she respected his space without invading, and how she chose him every day without pressure. Their marriage wasn't perfect, none is, but it was true. And Daniel, who suffered so much from being left, now knew the value of someone who stays. One Sunday afternoon, while reviewing old files on his computer to prepare a class, Daniel came across a saved video titled, "We." It was an old recording of a trip he'd taken years ago, when he was still married to Julia. The video showed the two of them riding their bikes along a wooded trail, laughing at their own antics and stopping to admire the sunset. Anna entered the room while he was watching. She sat beside him, observed silently, and after a few seconds, took his hand. Daniel looked at her, surprised she didn't say anything, but she simply smiled and said calmly, "It's beautiful to see who you were. It's beautiful to see who you've become." And in that gesture, he knew he didn't need to erase the past to fully live in the present. That loving someone new doesn't require forgetting the one you once loved, only learning not to go back there. A few years later, life brought another unexpected reunion. Julia was organizing a lecture on emotional reconnection in relationships for a social project that helped women undergoing personal reconstruction. One of the panelists was Daniel, now the author of a recently released book on literature, memory, and affection. When they met backstage, the embrace was natural, weightless, and free of tension. They spoke like two adults who know their own pain but no longer blame each other for it. Upon taking the stage, Julia introduced Daniel with sincerity. "Today I have the honor of sharing this space with someone who, more than an ex-husband, was part of the story that taught me to listen, even when it was too late to respond." The audience applauded, but what remained was a thick silence between the two as they exchanged a look that said, "We are at peace." After the event, they sat alone for a few minutes in a private room. There was nothing more to discuss, so the conversation flowed easily. Daniel told her that Anna was pregnant with their first child. Julia smiled sincerely and said she hoped the child would inherit his father's heart. He thanked her, unmistakably moved. Julia talked about the man she now shared her days with, and Daniel was happy to know she had found someone who saw beyond the mistakes she'd made. They laughed about old stories, exchanged book recommendations, and talked about growing older. When they said goodbye, they didn't say, "See you soon," or "Maybe someday." They simply looked at each other for a moment longer and accepted, tenderly, that this was the true end, a painless end. Years later, Daniel held his newborn daughter in his arms. Small, fragile, and incredibly alive. Anna, beside him, smiled wearily and radiantly. He looked at that tiny being and thought of all the times he thought he wouldn't have the strength to love again. He thought of Julia, not with longing, but with calm respect. Because, despite everything, part of the man he was now was formed in the ruins of that relationship. What had been built in pain now served as the foundation for what was born of love. Julia, in turn, walked hand in hand with her new partner down a dirt road in a small town where they had decided to spend a few days away from the hustle and bustle. There was a calmness in her eyes, a complete acceptance that life doesn't have to follow the imagined script to still be beautiful. From time to time, she thought of Daniel. Not with regret, but as a distant memory of a time that taught her not to ignore the essential. Their story had no reconciliation, no return. It had something rarer, understanding, truth, and a dignified farewell. The love that once existed wasn't thrown away, it was transformed. Into learning, into forgiveness, into growth. And perhaps this is the hardest ending to accept, one where there are no eternal villains or absolute heroes. Just human beings trying to love as best they can, even stumbling, even failing. If you've made it this far, this story certainly touched you in some way. Let us know in the comments what you thought, which part resonated most with you, and how this story made you reflect on love, forgiveness, and choices. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow more stories that show life as it really is, raw, beautiful, difficult, but always full of lessons. And here's the most important one: betrayal doesn't just destroy marriages. It destroys admiration, respect, and history. It implodes trust, taints memories, and dulls the shine of moments that were once real. Betrayal isn't just a mistake, it's a choice with consequences. And even if there's forgiveness, what's lost is never fully recovered. Here, on this channel, we don't and never will support any kind of betrayal. What we advocate is dialogue, truth, and the courage to face what's broken before hurting someone who only wanted to be loved. And if this story has taught you anything, let it be this: cherish those who truly love you. Because love is built with choices, and destroyed in the same way.